Pablo Escobar was not always the most feared man in Colombia. Before amassing fortunes, before building the Hacienda Napoles, and before appearing on the front pages of newspapers, there was a precise instant, an exact moment that lit a spark within him, one that would never go out. That moment came when he was just a young boy with simple dreams, empty pockets, and a bottled-up anger he didn't yet know how to channel. It was 1964, and the air in Envigado carried the smell of wet earth left behind by the night rains. At just 14 years old, Pablo lived in a modest home with his mother Hermilda, a schoolteacher, and his father Abel, a hard-working man who earned a living as a farmer and cattle trader. There were no luxuries or abundance, but there were clear rules: respect, discipline, and above all, the conviction to never let life break you. Yet reality does not always follow such rules. That Sunday, Abel decided to take his son to Medellin's market. They had raised 2 calves for months with patience, and selling them would allow the family to buy school uniforms, fix the leaking roof, and maybe treat themselves to a small indulgence. Pablo was thrilled. He loved watching his father negotiate, to see how he stared the buyers straight in the eye. To him it was almost a game, until that day when it stopped being one. In the midst of the noise and bustle of the market, surrounded by vendors shouting out their offers and the smell of fresh fruit, a man appeared who was different from the rest. He wore a spotless white suit, shiny shoes, and a fine hat. On his wrist gleamed a golden watch that caught the light with every movement of his hand. Everything about him radiated importance. The stranger approached Abel, inspected the calves, and smiled. "I'll give you a good price, my friend. I'll sell them in a few hours, and then you can come buy for your money." Abel hesitated for a moment, but the man's confidence was convincing. They sealed the deal on a scrap of paper, and the man took the animals away. Pablo watched him in awe, and with a hint of envy. How could someone speak with such authority? Time passed, the sun began to set, and as the market emptied, Abel went looking for the man in the white suit. He found him leaning casually against a wall, smoking calmly. "I've come for the money for the calves," Abel said, trying to sound firm. The man burst into laughter. "Calves? I don't owe you anything. Get out of here before I call the police." In that instant Pablo felt the world stop. He saw his father freeze, swallow his pride, turn around and walk away in silence. His hands, however, were trembling. The walk back home was weighed down by a silence heavier than any words. Pablo kept his eyes on the ground, but in his mind, the swindler's cynical smile wouldn't go away. That image pierced his heart like a dagger. That night, while the house slept, Pablo stayed awake at the kitchen table. He could not get what happened out of his mind. How could someone take what was yours, look you straight in the eye, and walk away unpunished? In the shadows, he made a promise that would shape his destiny: "I will never again allow anyone to humiliate me. And if they try, they will regret it." Those words, uttered with the repressed fury of an adolescent, were the seed of what was to come. From that seed grew cunning, ambition, the hunger for respect, and with them, inevitable violence. Ironically, Pablo had no idea just how far that determination would take him. He only knew he would never again let his family be trampled or feel inferior in the face of another man's power. He had no money, no weapons, no contacts, but he possessed something far more dangerous: an unbreakable conviction. From that day on, he began to see the world with different eyes. At school, he no longer saw just teachers and students but hierarchies, alliances, and opportunities. On the streets of Envigado, he began to notice who gave orders, who obeyed, and why. Slowly, he came to understand that in real life the rules were written by those daring enough to break them. What happened that day in the market was not just a scam, it was the start of a metamorphosis. Pablo ceased to be just a peasant boy and began shaping himself into someone who would never accept "no" as an answer. Though it would be years before the world heard his name, the story had already begun. The next morning after the humiliation, the sun shone over Envigado just as it always had, but for Pablo nothing was the same. While other kids thought about recess or soccer, he couldn't get the image of the man in the white suit out of his mind. It wasn't just about the lost money. It was something deeper: the realization that in this world, the powerful could crush the weak without consequences. That thought burned in him like an open wound. In class, he sat at the back, pretending to take notes while his mind wandered. He replayed the man's mocking laugh, his arrogant stare, and the cigarette between his fingers. And in silence, while the teacher wrote on the board, Pablo reaffirmed the promise he had made the night before: "I will never again be on the losing side." That thought stayed with him for days and weeks. He began observing everything more closely. Who had influence and who didn't? Who could walk into a store without paying, and who had to beg for credit? Who spoke and who merely listened? One afternoon after class, a group of older boys invited him to play soccer. Pablo knew it wasn't an innocent invitation. They were the ones who controlled the field, decided who played, who sat on the bench, and who was left out entirely. He accepted not to play but to observe, analyze, and measure the people around him. During the game, one of the boys, nicknamed El Flaco, cruelly mocked a younger boy who had missed a goal. It wasn't light teasing, it was humiliating. In that moment, Pablo recognized the same dynamic from the market. Someone confident, abusing someone weaker. This time he couldn't stay silent. "If you never miss a goal, it's because you never dare to try," he said with a cold smile. The field fell silent. It was rare for anyone to confront El Flaco. And although it nearly ended in a fight, something unexpected happened. Several boys approached Pablo afterward, telling him they admired his courage. It was the first time he realized that challenging someone could grant him power and respect. Not long after, he began working with older boys on small street businesses. They weren't major crimes, just quick errands. Selling single cigarettes, getting stolen bike parts, protecting stalls in the market. The pay was low, but money wasn't what mattered most to him. What truly drew him in was learning how the streets worked, how money moved, how loyalty was earned. At home, meanwhile, his mother Hermilda noticed that Pablo spent less time studying and more time outside. She thought it was just a phase, typical teenage rebellion. What she didn't know was that a silent plan was already forming in her son's mind, a strategy taking shape. Every time Pablo passed by the market where his father had been cheated, he couldn't help but look at the spot where it had happened. It was no longer just anger he felt, it had become a kind of inner fuel, a driving force pushing him never again to find himself in a position of weakness. With every passing day, that promise within him grew stronger and more dangerous. It was during those years that he began hearing stories of men who had made fortunes outside the law. In Envigado and Medellin, rumors spread about people with no education who lived in mansions, drove luxury cars, and wore expensive suits. When Pablo heard those stories, he didn't see them as mere criminals. To him, they were men no one dared to swindle. People who always had the last word. It was then that the image of the man in the white suit merged with a new idea. If he could steal and get away with it, then I can learn to play that game, and play it better. He didn't know it yet, but that mixture of resentment and ambition would become the driving force of his entire life. Months passed since the episode that had marked him. The neighborhood remained the same, walls plastered with posters, the smell of arepas in the morning, children running through dusty streets. But Pablo was no longer the same. One afternoon as he walked home, he came across a group of men gathered around an old car. This was no ordinary group. Among them was Don Raul, a man everyone knew had shady dealings. No one asked too many questions, but it was an open secret that he controlled money, favors, and contacts in his own way. Pablo watched from a distance, trying to catch what they were saying. Raul spoke in a firm voice, and the others listened as if his words were orders. In that instant, Pablo understood something important. Real power didn't lie in shouting or fighting, it lay in getting others to obey you without question. That very night, he decided to approach him. It wasn't easy. He waited for hours outside a cantina, avoiding stares and braving the cold. When Raul finally came out, Pablo approached without hesitation. "I want to work for you," he said directly. Raul looked him up and down and smirked. "And who are you to say that, kid?" Pablo didn't flinch. "I'm someone who learns fast, and never forgets who gives him a chance." That brief but calculated response caught Raul's attention. He didn't offer him work right away, but he told him to meet him the next day at the market. Pablo knew it was a test, and he was determined to pass. The next morning he arrived earlier than anyone. Raul gave him a simple but risky task: deliver a package to a neighborhood across town without opening it or asking questions. Pablo accepted and completed it without hesitation. He knew very well the package contained nothing legal, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was proving that he could be trusted. From then on, he began running small errands for Raul, delivering envelopes, collecting money, warning about police presence in certain areas. Each task was a lesson: how to move without drawing attention, who to greet and who to avoid, and above all, how to handle information so it was always valuable. Over time he earned Raul's trust. And it was then that the second event that would mark him deeply took place. One afternoon, while delivering an envelope, he saw him, the man in the white suit, the one who years ago had scammed his father. He looked older now, but his walk and that arrogant smile were the same. Pablo's hands burned, as if his whole body wanted to run and settle the score right there. But he didn't. He stayed still, watching him from a distance. And there he made another decision that would change his life. He would not act on impulse. If he was going to take revenge, it would be calculated, leaving no trace and making sure that man understood exactly who was in charge now. At that moment, Pablo realized that patience was as valuable as strength, and that sometimes, waiting for the right moment could be the difference between winning and losing everything. Night fell over Medellin like a heavy cloak. The streetlights flickered over the dusty roads, and the echo of a distant radio mixed with the murmurs of neighbors closing their doors early. In his family's small home, the atmosphere was tense. All day long, that memory had haunted him. The laughter of a policeman as he destroyed the bicycle that had cost him so much to get. For a boy barely 12 years old, that was not just losing an object, it was a public humiliation. His father, Antonio, tried to console him, but his words floated in the air without effect. That's life, son. Some are born with the power to trample others. In Pablo's eyes there were no more tears, but a strange, unsettling gleam, as if something bigger was being forged inside him. That night he couldn't sleep. He listened to the snores of his younger brother and the creaking of the wooden roof, while outside a dog barked endlessly. He replayed over and over in his mind the moment that policeman had taken what was his. He felt a mixture of helplessness and rage, but also a spark of determination. At dawn he decided he couldn't just sit idly by. He walked to where his uncle Abel worked, a man who had always lived outside the law and, according to rumors, had dangerous connections. Abel greeted him with a mocking smile. "What's wrong with you, kid? You look like you're ready to take on the world." Pablo, without hesitation, told him what had happened. Abel listened silently, then leaned closer and whispered, "In this life, Pablito, no one gives you anything. And if they take something from you, you get it back no matter what. But never forget, respect is either earned or taken." Those words carved themselves into Pablo's mind. It wasn't that he decided right then what he would later become, but a seed had been planted. He began to look at his surroundings with new eyes. He noticed how some men in the neighborhood were feared, not because of their physical strength but because of what they represented. They didn't ask for respect, they imposed it. A couple of days later, walking down the main street, he crossed paths with the same policeman who had smashed his bicycle. The man laughed with others as if nothing had happened. Pablo felt a knot in his stomach but didn't stop. He kept walking, watching, planning. In the following days he started hanging around with older boys known for their small-time hustles. He learned to move without being seen, to listen more than he spoke, and to size people up with a single glance. He was no longer just a boy burning for revenge, he was beginning to understand how the real game of power worked. And then one afternoon, at the busiest corner of the neighborhood, something happened that marked a before and after. Pablo was sitting on a bench when he heard a street vendor complain that some men had taken his goods without paying. No one reacted. People just stepped aside. At that moment, Pablo felt like his own story was repeating itself. He stood up and began to discreetly follow the culprits. He wasn't naive. He knew he couldn't confront them with force, but he could use cunning. And that night, without anyone understanding how, the vendor got his goods back and the thieves received a clear message: don't mess with Pablo. It was the first time his name became linked with both respect and fear in the neighborhood. Pablo, still just a teenager, discovered that this feeling was almost like a drug. That was the starting point of something much bigger. What had begun as a small revenge over a broken bicycle was turning into a way of seeing the world, never allowing anyone to step on him, and if they did, making sure it never happened again. Pablo didn't yet know it, but that drive would become the foundation for one of the most feared criminal empires in history. Everything, absolutely everything, traced back to that afternoon, that mocking laugh, and the lesson his uncle had taught him. In the dim light of his humble room, Pablo began to fill the pages of a worn-out notebook. They weren't just notes, but plans, ideas, names. It was as if a door had opened in his mind, one that could no longer be closed. On the last page he wrote a sentence that would echo throughout his life: respect is not asked for, it is taken. The days kept passing. To many he was still just another neighborhood kid, but the way he interpreted the world had completely changed. He observed everything with surgical precision. Who owed money? Who followed the rules? Who broke them? Who could become an ally, and who an obstacle? What used to be just the backdrop of his daily life was now a chessboard on which he was learning to move each piece. At home, his mother, Dona Hermilda, noticed the change. He had always been curious, but now his questions carried a different weight. He wanted to understand how debts worked, why some people worked tirelessly and never escaped poverty, while others, without lifting a finger, lived surrounded by luxury. She tried to answer with simple explanations, unaware that these questions only fueled Pablo's hunger for answers. Pablo didn't interrupt, but he stored every word, every detail, every name. That night, lying in bed, he replayed the story in his mind like a puzzle. It wasn't just curiosity, he had realized that true power lay in connecting the right information to the right person at the right time. In his mind, an invisible map was taking shape, linking debts, commitments, favors, and loyalties. The next day, without being asked, he approached one of the men involved and gave him a brief piece of advice. If you take the old road to Envigado, don't cross the wooden bridge. They're waiting for you there. The man, surprised, followed the warning and managed to escape an ambush. He never asked how Pablo knew, but he understood the boy had eyes and ears everywhere. The rumor spread in whispers. Pablo wasn't seeking fame, but people were beginning to see him as someone who found unusual solutions. His name was gaining weight, not because he talked too much but because he delivered. But growth brought new trials. A group of older boys, jealous of his rising influence, confronted him one night on a dark street. There were 3 of them. They shoved him against a wall and one said mockingly, "We hear you think you're someone important, Escobar." Pablo didn't raise his voice or move suddenly. He looked at each of them and said something that caught them off guard. "If you're going to hit me, do it now. But remember, we all have families and words travel faster than fists." They didn't fully understand what he meant, but the firmness with which he said it made them back off. Nothing happened that night, but the message stuck. Pablo was no easy target and any action against him would come at a price. That experience strengthened his conviction that true power didn't always lie in brute force but in how others perceived you. From that day on, he measured every gesture, every word, every look. He discovered that even silence could be turned into a weapon. At home, life carried on. He helped his mother as much as he could, and though money was scarce, he always found a way to ensure nothing essential was missing. But deep inside, he had sworn something, that he would never again depend on anyone's charity. That determination had been born the day that policemen smashed his bicycle, and now it burned brighter than ever. An unexpected event sped everything up. A neighborhood acquaintance, Martín, had gotten a job as a shop assistant in Medellín but was unfairly fired and left penniless. Pablo heard about it and, thanks to the contacts he was beginning to weave, found him another job within days. He didn't do it just out of kindness. He knew every favor was a future investment. Weeks later, Martín repaid him by sharing valuable information about a shipment of goods that was about to arrive and still had no owner. Pablo didn't act immediately but stored the information like a hidden jewel. Around that time, he began to carefully observe how the informal markets worked, the clandestine deals, the small exchanges that escaped the authorities' control. He didn't participate directly, but he analyzed every move, every unspoken rule, every gesture that betrayed a secret negotiation. His ability to read people sharpened until he could anticipate when someone was lying or driven by fear. That skill, combined with his memory and his network of acquaintances, turned him into someone who, without fully intending it, was already playing in a different league. One day, while walking down a lonely street, he came face to face with the same police officer who had marked his childhood. The man, now older and with a worn-out uniform, looked at him in surprise. Pablo greeted him with a slight nod and kept walking. They didn't exchange words, but at that moment he understood that he was no longer the helpless child he once had been. Life had taught him that respect is forged through control, information, and strategy. Without realizing it yet, he was writing the foundations of a manual that would guide every one of his decisions in the years to come. He was in no rush. He knew that each move had to be made carefully, like placing a stone on a bridge rising over a raging river. While others chased quick profits, he set out to build something solid, something that could not be brought down by bad luck or an unexpected blow. That night, when he returned home, he opened the notebook where he kept his phrases and notes and added a new line: "True power is invisible until it decides to reveal itself." And so, quietly and without ostentation, Pablo Escobar continued to shape himself, guided by the scars of the past and by the vision of a future where he would be the one dictating the rules. Days passed, then weeks, then months. Pablo, still very young, was no longer seen merely as the sharp-eyed boy who had grown up in a humble neighborhood, but as someone weaving an invisible web around him. His childhood friends still called him Pablito, but out in the streets, among men used to dealing with matters that could rarely be spoken of out loud, his name was starting to carry weight. The event that pushed him decisively down that path happened one scorching afternoon when the city seemed to burn under the sun. Pablo was sitting on a bench in the central plaza watching people come and go. In the distance he saw a scene that made him frown. A young man barely older than him was arguing with 2 men in worn-out suits. The young man gestured desperately while the others looked at him with a cold calm, like predators who know the prey cannot escape. Pablo couldn't hear the entire conversation, but a few words were enough. Deadline, interest, consequences. He didn't need more to understand that it was a debt threatening to cost more than just money. When the two men walked away, Pablo approached the young man. "What did they demand from you?" he asked directly. With a trembling voice, the young man confessed that he had taken a loan to help his family, but the interest rates were so high it was now impossible to pay. He had 3 days to gather the money or lose far more than his belongings. Pablo listened in silence, arms crossed. Then he stood up and said, "Don't worry, I'll talk to them." It wasn't the first time he had gotten involved in other people's problems, but this time it was different. It wasn't just about giving advice or warning about danger, it was about facing men who thrived on fear. That same night he went to find them. He located them in a dark tavern, drinking aguardiente and playing dominoes. Without asking for permission, he dragged a chair over and sat in front of them, staring straight at them. "I'm here to talk about Andres' debt," he said firmly without hostility. The men exchanged mocking glances. "And who are you to get involved?" one of them replied. Pablo gave a faint smile. "I'm someone who understands that a broken deal hurts everyone. If you strip him of everything now, he'll never be able to pay you. But if you give him time, you might not get 100% back, but you'll get something." The largest of the two let out a short laugh, but it didn't last. Pablo, without breaking eye contact, added, "And I also know where you keep the rest of your business. And trust me, you don't want others to know that." The room went silent. It wasn't an explicit threat, but it made it clear he wasn't a reckless teenager. After a few seconds of tension, they agreed to give Andres another month. The next day, Andres was overflowing with gratitude, but Pablo only said, "Remember who helped you. One day you'll repay me." That simple phrase became a rule he would apply over and over. Every favor, every intervention, every gesture was a seed planted for the future, and those seeds were beginning to bear fruit. Over time, people began to seek him out to solve problems they would have once trusted others with. He didn't accept every case, he carefully chose which ones to get involved in. But when he did, he made sure everyone knew it had been Pablo Escobar who delivered the solution. His handling of information became more refined. He didn't just listen. He cross-checked data, confirmed details, and stored them in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that would eventually fit together. It was around this time that a ghost from the past reappeared. His mother, Hermilda, asked him to go with her to the downtown market. Among the fruit stalls and fabric vendors, Pablo came across the same police officer who had smashed his bicycle as a child. The man, with his frayed uniform and face worn by time, recognized him instantly. "You're that boy from back then?" he said, startled and uneasy. Pablo looked him straight in the eye and replied calmly, "Yes, and you're the one who taught me that you can't rely on other people's kindness." The officer swallowed hard and walked away in silence. For Pablo, that moment was symbolic. He was no longer the vulnerable child. Now he was the one who could make others uncomfortable with just a look. That night he wrote in his notebook, "Never forget who showed you the harshness of the world. They are the ones who shape you even without meaning to." What he didn't know then was that this principle, to remember and repay every lesson, would become the backbone of his life. He also understood something essential. Respect was not asked for, it was taken, and he was learning how to take it without a weapon. Opportunities to prove it multiplied. A merchant, robbed and desperate because the police did nothing, got most of his stolen goods back 2 days later thanks to Pablo. He never explained how he did it, only warned, "Next time, be careful who you let into your shop." These kinds of actions built a reputation that grew like a shadow at sunset. Slow, quiet, but impossible to stop. Though still young, Pablo had already decided that no one else would dictate his fate. With time, he was no longer just the sharp kid from the neighborhood, he was a reference point. On street corners, in stores, in hushed conversations, his name came up more and more, always with the respect reserved for someone who could solve problems, or create them. Yet he never forgot that it all began with that moment of helplessness in his childhood. The bicycle smashed by a corrupt policeman, the look of disdain that marked him like an invisible scar. That memory wasn't just a grudge, it was a compass reminding him why he could never hand his destiny over to anyone else. That compass pointed him again when a group of armed men from another neighborhood arrived to collect debts and settle scores. The tension was so high that one spark could have set everything ablaze. Pablo understood that this conflict could destroy the respect he had built, so he acted before things escalated. He didn't use empty threats, he used his most powerful weapon, information. He went to the house where the newcomers were staying and, without violence, made it clear that he knew who they were, where they came from, and what they had done elsewhere. It was as if someone had opened a book of their past and read it aloud. The message was clear: here nothing was imposed. Here you negotiated, or you paid the price. They realized that facing him would be a mistake and left before dawn. The neighborhood returned to calm, and Pablo's reputation climbed another rung. Now he was seen not just as someone who solved problems, but as a protector of the territory. That night as he walked home, he reflected on the path he had taken. He had not sought to be a leader in the traditional sense. He wasn't a politician, a merchant, or an official figure, but he had something none of them had: the ability to act where others could not or would not. And he had learned that true power did not always come from weapons or money, but from loyalty, and from fear properly administered. A dangerous mix, but an extremely effective one. Weeks later, while resting at home, his mother told him someone had left a package. Pablo opened it and found a new bicycle wrapped in brown paper with a handwritten note. "So you never forget how it all began." There was no signature, but he immediately knew it was from Andres, the young man whose debt he had helped renegotiate. The gesture made him smile and at the same time reinforced his belief that every action sparks a reaction. That bicycle wasn't just a gift, it was a reminder that networks of favors were as valuable as any treasure. Over the years, this principle would lead him to weave a much larger web, one that would go beyond his neighborhood and reach places he could not yet imagine. In that moment, sitting in his worn-out living room with the bicycle in front of him, Pablo understood that the event that had marked his life wasn't just the day a policeman destroyed his first means of transportation, but everything that followed. Every injustice he had witnessed, every person he had helped, every lesson he had learned in the unforgiving streets had shaped him step by step. That first blow was just the spark, but what truly shaped him was his unbreakable decision never to let life push him against the wall again. He had promised himself he would never again feel insignificant, fragile, or cornered. There were still many chapters left to write in his story. And although the world would end up remembering him for very different reasons, those who had shared those early years with him knew that behind the man who would leave his mark on Colombia's history still lived the boy who had once looked at his shattered bicycle and sworn no one would crush him again. That silent vow became the foundation upon which everything that followed would be built. And so, almost without realizing it, Pablo Escobar had begun the path that would lead him to become one of the most feared, respected, and remembered men of his time. A path that, for better or worse, would transform not only his own life but the lives of thousands around him. The boy with the broken bicycle had become the young man taking the reins of his destiny, and soon the man who would control far more than that.